What a wonderful world. I see skies of blue, clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're saying, I love you. I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Now you can hear me. Should I go back? So I was telling you the history of Earth Day, which started in 1970, basically as a response to some big disasters, environmental disasters. The Santa Barbara oil spill and the Cuyahoga River fires in 1969. So many Americans kind of galvanized around the feeling that it was time to take more responsible and being more responsive to the whole notion of stewardship of the planet. So there were these teach-ins on college campuses, and in April, the EPA Journal told the story of that first Earth Day. It was on that day that Americans made it clear that they understood and were deeply concerned over the deterioration of our environment and the mindless dissipation of our resources. So that day left a permanent impact on politics of America. In short, that first Earth Day in 1970 launched the environmental decade. But the concerns articulated at that time pale in comparison to what we're facing now with climate change. Jay Inslee, who is the governor of Washington State, said, "We are the first generation to feel the sting of climate change, and the last generation that can do anything about it." So we've all heard a lot of the data on climate crisis, so I would spend a lot of time, but I just want to give you a quick global snapshot, a few zingers, what's going on around the globe. Of course, it's forecast that there'll be an increase of a 2-degree global temperature increase within the next 20 years, putting us at that tipping point that we always hear about. But over the by 2100, that increase moves up to 4 degrees, and that has catastrophic consequences. Now, while California is experiencing drought conditions all over the state, the number of floods and periods of heavy rain have quadrupled since 1980. And then that doubled since 2004. In North America, snow cover has decreased 5% annually since 1966. Elsewhere, the epic snows of Kilimanjaro are 80% gone today. In the US, in 2019, there were over 120,000 extreme weather records, including snow in Hawaii and heat waves in Alaska. In India, between the year 1980 and 1999, there were 213 heat waves, but between 2000 and 2018, roughly that same increment of time, there were 1,400. In Iran, in 2017, the temperature hit 129.2 degrees, one of the hottest temperatures ever recorded. The number of extreme heat waves in Europe has doubled between 1960 and 2018. In Australia, bushfires between June of 2019 and March of 2020 swept across more than 48 million acres, killing 1 billion animals. Over 674 billion pounds of CO2 were emitted during that emergency. After the height of the bushfires, Sydney experienced 15.4 inches of rainfall, the most rainfall since 1990. In Somalia, famine killed 258,000 people between 2010 and 2012, in just 2 years. It failed to rain there 3 seasons in a row, 2016, 17, and 18. And over one 48-hour period in 2017, 110 people died from starvation and drought-related illnesses. Well, that's enough for the global snap shooting, and I think we all get the picture, and it's not a pretty picture. The 6th assessment of the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their 6th assessment was just completed in February of this year. And while previous reports focused on all of the adverse consequences of climate change, this most recent report included a lot of information on vulnerability, which is defined as the lack of capacity to cope and adapt as it applies to regions of the globe and human beings and livelihoods and to other species and ecosystems. Now, the climate crisis is a theological issue. And why it's so important for the church to reckon with it as such is made very clear in Matthew 25, when Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. What you did for one of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." And we also know that he said, "What you did not do for them, you did not do for me." So Jesus is talking about the same kind of people that are defined in the 6th assessment. What we do or do not do for the most vulnerable, those who don't have the means or the resources to cope with the changes that are happening on the planet, the droughts, the famines, the fires, the floods, the extreme heat and extreme cold. These are the most vulnerable in today's climate crisis. So Jesus calls us to do for them as we would do for him. And that is where we find Christ, right in the heart center of the most vulnerable among us in the world today. And Jesus also said, the poor are always with us. But today we have a new kind of poor and vulnerable. We're talking about a whole generation of climate refugees, displaced from their homes by climate disasters. The World Bank has predicted that by 2050, 200 million refugees will have fled their homes for climate-related reasons. Now, St. John's is known to be, and I think is proud to be known, as a social justice church. In recent years, tens of thousands of people have fled Central America, for example, countries like Honduras and Guatemala. And they're not only leaving because of gang violence, they're leaving because drought and extreme weather conditions have made it impossible to grow crops. Life can't be sustained there anymore. In Bangladesh, hundreds of thousands of people are displaced every year by larger and more unpredictable monsoon floods. The World Bank says 8 million people have left that country so far. West Africa, similar story. In the Caribbean, massive hurricanes drive people out of their homes every year now. Far from being a future concern, climate change-driven migration and displacement is already happening all over the globe. Last summer, we all experienced the end-to-end fires in California. My niece had just moved from Seattle and bought a new home in Paradise. And yes, her home was destroyed by that fire, along with the whole rest of the town. So we might say that climate catastrophe sort of levels the playing field. Everyone is affected. No one can escape the devastating effects of the climate crisis. But most people living in Paradise could recover. Most have already rebuilt their homes, their towns, their lives. Their homes were insured, for the most part. They could rebuild and start over. Their homes were insured. Trauma aside, they will be fine. They're already fine. In our country, we have the infrastructure and the resources, for the most part, certainly not everywhere, not everyone. But we're not among those that Jesus was talking about, the least of these. There are an ever-increasing number of people all over the globe that are in that group. And why this is a matter for the church is that Jesus, whom we claim to follow, calls us to do for them as we would do for him. So this is central to our faith. And it's probably the biggest justice issue the world has ever seen so far. So here's a second reason why climate change is an issue for the church. And it's probably number one. It's that God's precious gift of creation is at risk, and it's human activity that's destroying it. So I want to suggest that this is a call to all of us to take up the cross and carry it as we work on all the ways that we can to be a part of the solution to the climate crisis. So what are we in the pew to do? The words of youth climate activist Greta Thunberg provide us with one appropriate response to that question when she said, "We cannot solve a crisis without treating it like a crisis." In the March edition of the Community Connection newsletter, which is the monthly newsletter that I write at the mission homes every month, Our brand new creation care team published a long list of ways in which we might live more sustainably on our good Mother Earth, God's gift to life on this planet. And with the list was a challenge to focus on only 3 of those many ways listed. The first one was reducing your use of fossil fuels by driving less and walking more, reducing it in whatever way you can. Eating less meat, because we all know that the agricultural industry and the raising and slaughtering and delivering of the farm animals is a big contributor to climate change. And finding ways, the third thing we suggested was finding ways to cut back on your use of water. So we know that governments, corporations, financial institutions who invest in the fossil fuel industry, these powerful social structures in our world must make the biggest shifts and change their current policies to a new direction of advancing the use of sustainable energy. That they continue to support the fossil fuel industry for their own profits and personal gain at the expense of all life on the planet is a sin of epic proportions. But we must also find a way to avoid being the consumers of fossil fuels and petroleum products, like the ubiquitous plastics that are everywhere, on everything. It's estimated that 150 million metric tons of plastic circulate in the world's oceans. We need to stop contributing to those numbers as a matter of practicing our faith and our love of the Creator. We need to start behaving like we are living in an ecological crisis, because we are. So there's another way this translates into our everyday life. And why? Well, we all need to be climate activists. For one thing, starting with pressuring those most responsible for the climate crisis. The corporations that put profit ahead of people. We need to put pressure on the fossil fuel industry to transition to clean energy. We need to put pressure on governments and policymakers. I got an email recently from Green Faith, which is a global organization that's galvanizing the faith communities all around the world to work together on fighting climate change. And in this email, there was a pledge that they invited me to sign that I would not vote for any candidate that did not include in his or her platform a strong position of action on the climate crisis. So that's another thing we can do. And that's a really important one. So we can write letters, we can sign petitions, we can make phone calls. We can all become climate activists. I think I've told this story to some of you, the story of how I became vegan in response to the climate change. My grandson, Karim, was a kid who loved nothing more than having a burger for dinner or a big juicy steak. So I made sure whenever he came to visit that I had plenty of that kind of food to serve him. Well, as he learned more about climate change and learned about what the global food production was producing 26% of greenhouse gases, and that animal agriculture accounted for 52% of that, Karim and a group of his 16-year-old buddies all decided to become vegan. And they carried that home to their families and talked about it. And I can remember the night I was sitting at home with a piece of chicken on my fork, carrying it to my mouth, and I couldn't put it in. And that's the last animal meat I have ever eaten. So Karim is a freshman this year at Cornell, majoring in environmental studies. And it's hopeful to me that our young people are really getting involved in this issue. So we might be thinking that what this little bit that I can do, my few years of life that are left, what difference does it make? But I think it actually makes a big difference. Maybe not in changing the climate trajectory in a big, significant way, but here's why I think it's important, that we each do whatever little bit we can do. 3 reasons. Do you remember that Pete Seeger song? I'm sure Mo does. The chorus of which was, when 2 and 2 and 50 make a million, we'll see the world come round. We'll see the world come round. Okay, I didn't sing it. If more and more of us stop eating meat, switch to solar energy in our homes, buy a new or even used electric vehicle, reduce our use of water, collectively, we can make a difference. 2 and 2 and 50 make a million. Now, it is our young people that are the ones that are left to live in our hotter, more turbulent, and weather-distressed world. So our children and our grandchildren and our nieces and nephews, the young people in our lives, will see our actions. They will see us modeling a changed way of living. And they will know and remember us as someone who made sacrifices and fought with our whole heart and soul to leave them with a livable future. It will make a big difference in the kind of legacy we leave behind us. So that's the second reason that what we do as individuals is important. And finally, and maybe most importantly, we want God to know that we did everything within our power to restore this precious gift of creation. I believe it will make a huge difference to us knowing that we knew and understood what humans were doing to the planet, and that we responded with all our passion to do our part to turn it around. That we spent whatever time we have left on God's good earth doing the holy work of greening our lives. It will make a huge difference in who we are before God. Amen. And I believe it is now time to stand and sing one of my favorite hymns, God of the Sparrow, on page 272 of your hymnal.